Welcome to the Rise to Intimacy podcast. I'm your host, Valerie McDonald, and for over a decade, I've worked as a sex and couples therapist because intimacy used to feel really overwhelming for me. I felt a lot of pressure to perform, I was disconnected from my body, and I often felt like desire was out of reach for me. But through my own trauma work, I stopped checking out of my body and started feeling connected to it again. I learned what it's like to experience intimacy without fear, without shutting down, and without numbing out. Now I'm on a mission to help you do the same thing. This podcast exists because trauma doesn't get the last word. You can learn how to calm your body, change the story you've been carrying, and rebuild real connection. First with yourself and then with the people you love. Let's begin. If you've listened to this podcast for a while, you know that desire discrepancy is a topic I come back to frequently, because it is one of the most common things couples come to see me for in my practice. So to recap, desire discrepancy is when your desire for sex is different from your partner's level of desire. So today I'm going to discuss something I frequently get asked about, both by clients and by listeners. And that is, how do I know if what we're experiencing is just a normal part of being in a long-term relationship, or if it's actually a problem that needs outside support? Because those are two very different things. And the answer matters because treating a normal phase of a relationship like a crisis can create damage that wasn't there before. And on the other side, dismissing something that actually needs help as just normal can allow resentment, disconnection, and in some cases, betrayal to creep in unnoticed. So today, I'm going to help you figure out the difference. And before we get into it, if any of what I share today resonates with you, and you're wondering whether what you and your partner are navigating might need professional support, I'd love to talk with you. So head over to risetointimacy.com to book a complimentary consultation with me today. So first, let's talk about if what you're experiencing is normal, because I think it's important that you don't walk away from this episode convinced that something is wrong with you or your relationship when it might not be. Research shows that desire discrepancy is one of the most frequent issues couples report in therapy. And one study found that around 80% of couples experience mismatched libidos at some point in their relationship. So if you and your partner are not perfectly in sync when it comes to wanting sex, you are in the vast majority of long-term couples. And desire discrepancy is not the same as sexual incompatibility. It's typically a relational pattern you can shift, not a fixed problem. A gap in desire does not mean you and your partner are wrong for each other. It just means that you're human beings in a long-term relationship, and that is exactly what long-term relationships look like at times. And something else important to note is that a lot of what gets labeled as desire discrepancy in couples is actually something different. It's a difference in desire style, not desire itself. So there are two primary types of sexual desire. I've mentioned them before, but they are spontaneous desire, which is a desire that rises up on its own before any sexual stimulus or context. Whereas responsive desire is desire that emerges in response to things like connection or touch or foreplay, but not before it. And research suggests that roughly 75% of men and only about 15% of women report mostly spontaneous desire as their default pattern. So this means that for most women, and for many men as well, desire doesn't show up first and then lead to sex. And this is certainly contrary to what we've been told most of our lives growing up. We're basically told, if you want sex, you should notice that ahead of time, and therefore you ask for it, or if your partner asks for it, you're totally up for it. But instead, what really happens is it shows up once the conditions feel right, once there's a feeling of safety and connection, and some form of sex has already begun. Again, this can be some type of foreplay, can even just be kissing or feeling really emotionally connected to your partner. So a partner with responsive desire doesn't automatically indicate that they are less interested in sex. They just experience desire differently. So this is important for couples. When a spontaneous desire partner initiates and their responsive desire partner doesn't immediately feel interested, the spontaneous partner tends to read that as rejection. and therefore they may become more persistent. As a result, the responsive partner might begin to feel pressured. And because responsive desire requires a sense of ease and safety and no pressure, the pressure can reduce their capacity to feel desire at all. So then what happens is that gap between the two of you widens. And it's not because one person wants sex too much and the other doesn't want it enough, but because two people with different desire styles don't have a shared framework for understanding what's happening between them. Early relationships are fueled by novelty and dopamine, which can create frequent spontaneous desire even for both people. But long-term relationships tend to shift toward intentional connection and responsive desire. So that's a developmental shift in relationships. It's not just a warning sign something is absolutely wrong. So if what I'm describing so far sounds familiar, that pattern alone does not mean you have a serious problem. It may mean you need a new framework and some better tools for communication, but that is definitely something you can make progress on. So if desire discrepancy is so common and so normal, how do you know when it crosses the line into needing outside support? In my clinical experience, desire discrepancy becomes a genuine problem requiring real attention when it stops being about differing levels of desire and starts producing lasting emotional damage to one or both partners or to the relationship itself. So let me walk you through some of the common signs I look for to know the difference. The first sign is resentment that has started to accumulate. Desire does not survive chronic resentment well. When one or both partners are carrying accumulated hurt feelings that have not been addressed, intimacy tends to be one of the first things that suffers. The lower desire partner often cannot name this directly and experiences it as simple disinterest, while the higher desire partner experiences it as rejection. But resentment and desire cannot coexist for long and sometimes at all. So when I see a couple where one or both partners have stopped making repair attempts, meaning where there's a coldness or a distance that lives outside the sexual space, that tells me their desire discrepancy has already begun producing relational damage that needs to be addressed directly. The second sign is that sex has become obligatory. Obligatory sex, meaning engaging in sexual activity primarily to fulfill the desires or expectations of one partner, even when the other doesn't feel genuine desire, leads to a cycle of dissatisfaction and pressure and, again, resentment and emotional distance. And this is what I often hear from women in my practice. They will describe going along with sex not because they want to, but because it's easier than the conversation that would follow if they said no, or because they are managing their partner's emotional response and it feels less risky to just push through it. When sex becomes something one person endures in order to manage the other person's feelings, that is not a desire problem anymore. That is a consent and safety problem. The third sign is that you've stopped being able to talk about it. Adults who struggle with communicating about sex within their relationship are particularly likely to experience desire discrepancy as a serious, deep-rooted problem. When couples can no longer have a conversation about their sexual relationship outside of a heated moment, meaning when every attempt to bring it up ends in conflict or shutdown, or one person leaving the room, the communication breakdown itself becomes the primary problem to solve. The fourth sign is emotional disconnection that has spread beyond sex. So couples should consider seeking help when differences in sexual desire are causing ongoing stress. Again, feeling disconnected emotionally, or a conflict that they haven't been able to resolve on their own. In my practice, I pay attention to whether the distance I'm seeing exists only in the sexual relationship, or whether it has started to seep into the rest of the relationship too. So couples who've stopped laughing together, stopped touching outside the bedroom, and stopped checking in on each other are experiencing a disconnection that didn't just start in the bedroom. And it usually won't be fixed there either. And the fifth sign is when one or both partners has started to look elsewhere. When sex is unsatisfying or non-existent, it can account for up to 50 to 70% of relationship dissatisfaction. When a desire gap goes on too long without being addressed, it puts the relationship at risk. It doesn't mean the relationship is doomed, but it does make you more vulnerable. And both partners end up carrying that risk, whether they're the one being turned down or the one feeling like a disappointment. And as a result, things like emotional affairs, withdrawal, and turning away from the partnership in ways that become very hard to reverse may show up. So if you recognize any of these signs in your relationship, it doesn't mean your relationship is over, but it does mean the window for intervention is now, before the damage compounds further. And that is exactly what sex therapy is for. So one of the most difficult things I witness as a therapist is a couple that knows something is wrong and is genuinely trying to fix it, and watching their efforts make things worse. Because the way most couples instinctively respond to desire discrepancy tends to deepen the pattern they are trying to escape. More initiation creates more pressure. More pressure creates more avoidance. More avoidance creates more resentment. And before long, the couple isn't dealing with a desire problem anymore. They are dealing with a relational wound that has been accumulating for months or years without either person fully realizing it. Research has identified 4 distinct patterns in how partners respond to sexual rejection, and those patterns have a significant impact on both sexual and relationship satisfaction. Now, the 2 that cause the most damage are the ones rooted in resentment and insecurity. And what makes them particularly tricky is that they are rarely intentional. They may show up as a sigh or a shift in mood, a subtle withdrawal that the other partner is left to interpret and manage. But those small moments accumulate into something much bigger over time. So if that sounds like you, start paying attention to how your reaction affects your partner. Your hurt is valid, but they are left carrying it too. And that is a weight that makes desire even less accessible, not more. This is why I often tell couples the way you are currently trying to solve this is part of what is sustaining it, because you're working with the only tools you've got. And this problem usually calls for different tools than the ones most people walk in with. So when couples come to me with desire discrepancy that has crossed into the stage I've just been describing, here's what we actually work on. The first thing I do is help both partners figure out what's driving the gap. Is it a spontaneous versus responsive difference that's never been named? Is it resentment from unresolved conflict? Is it stress and burnout from months without real connection? Or something physical like pain or trauma? Each one of those needs a different approach, so understanding the reason matters. When desire discrepancy appears suddenly following medication changes, surgery, a physical illness, a referral to a medical specialist may be necessary before or alongside couples' work. I always need to rule out physiological contributors before I assume this is purely a relational issue. The second thing we work on is communication, specifically building a way to talk about your sexual relationship outside of the moments when things are already heated. Most couples in distress are only having this conversation in the worst possible context. One person is aroused and initiating sex. The other is not interested. And the conversation that follows happens in the middle of rejection and disappointment on both sides. So we establish a different container for that conversation. Scheduled low stakes outside the bedroom with a structure that gives both people room to speak and be heard. The third thing we work on is rebuilding the conditions where desire can actually return. Desire will not thrive again in resentment or emotional disconnection. Rebuilding non-sexual intimacy through things like affection, quality time, and emotional vulnerability restores the conditions where desire has room to grow. This often means temporarily taking the pressure of sex off the table entirely, so that physical affection can exist again, without pressure and without it automatically feeling like a negotiation. And then rebuilding slowly at a pace that the lower desire partner can tolerate, rather than feeling dragged through the process. And I know this may sound contradictory to what happens in sex therapy. Many people are assuming that in sex therapy, I'm going to tell you to go have sex all the time, or encourage you to do some type of sexual touch that can feel pretty provocative when you haven't been having sex for a long time. What happens instead is there's a ton of work that we put into increasing and nurturing emotional intimacy before we tackle the physical intimacy. It doesn't mean we can't tackle it at all, but especially when there's things like trauma, asking somebody to go and have sex or engage in sexual touch can cause even more pressure, and then you just might stop showing up for sessions. So we have to create a space where safety exists for both people. The couples who put in this work come out the other side with something new, but it's not a return to how things felt in the beginning. That's not what I'm promising, and anyone who tells you otherwise isn't being straight with you. But what you can find is something more sustainable. A sexual relationship that is mutual, that is honest, where both people feel seen and wanted, and where intimacy deepens over time rather than quietly fading. That is what is possible. This is also not me saying that you can't have a great sexual relationship after sex therapy. Absolutely you can. But again, thinking back to the beginning of relationships, they thrive on different things, again, like dopamine and novelty, that don't tend to just regularly show up in long-term relationships. The hope and the goal is that you can both learn ways to communicate with each other about what you truly need and want. Sometimes this is the first time you're hearing your partner actually state what they truly do desire. And when that happens, when you both feel safe enough to initiate and safe enough to say no when you truly are not up for sex, that creates a connection that allows a more natural, enjoyable way of having sex together where you both can feel enthusiastic. And that is absolutely a fulfilling sex life. So that is what is possible. And in my experience, it is available to most couples who are willing to do the work. So let me bring this back to the question I started with. How do you know if what you're experiencing is normal or a real problem that needs to be addressed? So here's the simplest way I can put it. Desire discrepancy is normal. The fluctuation of desire over the course of a long relationship is normal. One person wanting sex more than the other at any given time is also normal. But get help when the gap creates unaddressed resentment, when sex starts feeling obligatory, or when either of you starts looking outside the relationship to get your needs met. So if you recognize your relationship in any of those descriptions, I want you to know that it is not too late. But it is important to start prioritizing working on this with the help of a trusted professional. And I would love to help you. So head over to risetointimacy.com to book a consultation with me. So whether you're the higher desire partner who has been feeling rejected and invisible, or the lower desire partner has been feeling pressured and ashamed, or some combination of both, this is the type of work I do in my 6-month program for couples. And if someone in your life needed to hear this today, please share it with them. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next week. Thanks for listening to the Rise to Intimacy podcast. If today's episode resonated with you, know that healing is possible and you don't have to do it alone. If you're enjoying the show, please leave a rating and review for us at ratethispodcast.com/rise. It really helps others find us, and I'm so grateful for all your support. You can learn more about my coaching packages for individuals and couples at risetointimacy.com. And remember, sex therapy isn't for people who are broken. It's for people brave enough to look beneath the surface.